Diena, gerbama auditorija, aš dabar įsijungsiu į anglų kalbą, pradėsime mūsų seminarą. So now I'm switching into English, the official language of our seminar, and we have gathered here for the international seminar entitled Sugihara, Zwartendijk and Wallenberg, Civil Carriage Role Models Relevant for the Modern World. So my name is Linas Venslauskas. I work at Vytautas Magnus University and Sugihara Diplomats for Life Foundation, and in so-called Sugihara House Museum we are constantly working on researching the examples, especially the diplomats who contributed in saving Jews during the Second World War, during the Holocaust. So our museum mainly was about Sugihara and Zwartendijk, but now we're expanding the scope because it is obvious that there are more diplomats contributing to the issue. For example, here in Kaunas, the British ambassador, Mr. Preston, also contributed into the case. That was the beginning, and then we were approached by the Swedish embassy, and Swedish embassy suggested we have some kind of joint efforts to search for some differences and similarities, because Raul Wallenberg is very well-known Swedish diplomat, also rescuing Jews during the Second World War. But at the same time, then we discussed that actually we know some names which we should remember and speak of, but at the same time we should also speak about those people those diplomats who we still do not know. And it was the trigger point to remember those people who diplomats who already are known, but to build the network of possible new names on this honorable list. So at the very beginning, I would like to thank Swedish Embassy and Ambassador His Excellency Lars Wahlund for the initiative. Also, our event is sponsored by the Swedish Institute. Our sincere gratitude to our partners. And now we will start our seminar. It's a little bit different type of seminar, because there will be not only the presentations, there will be some pieces of Klezmer music. So it would be interesting, let's say, a joyful experience, I presume. But at the very beginning, there are 6 empty places in front of us. So I presume our speakers and Semmy, our musician, have the idea why those chairs are there. So you are comfortably sitting on the dark side of the stage. So I now would like to invite you to come to those places. But some technical details while coming and taking the seat. Could you please stand in front, and we will take a picture for the next generations. Okay, so please just line in front of the places, and then you can take the place whichever you find suitable for you. So you're most welcome to take your places. Sammy, you also. Yes, if you could. It's up to you. It's up to you. And these are some. Yeah. We stand together. Oh yeah. Absolutely. So that would be your place. Okay.
Drop your violin. I mean,
and now look at the camera.
Oh, good.
And now we go here? Yeah, take your seats. Yes, some pictures for our memories of the event. And now we will continue with our program. And the program, as I said, is organized like a few presentations, then Klezmer music, then presentations. If we will have some questions, that will be the final route for posing the questions. But actually the program is rather intensive, and the idea is to have the presentations from different angles, meaning Swedish will speak about Wallenberg perception and legacies, Japanese would speak about Sugihara, and Dutch would be speaking about Zwartendijk's legacies. But our first speaker would be His Excellency Lars Waglund, Ambassador of Sweden and Lithuania. And I have some orientational title for the presentations. Otherwise, we left for the decider for the presenters to decide. So the title is Role of Diplomacy in Today's World and Lessons for Distinguished Diplomats, Prominent, Forgotten and Unknown. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I stand here?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear me clear and loud. We have gathered here today, and it's from the beginning an idea of the Swedish Embassy in Paris, actually, who sits there in the front line, to share the stories of some remarkable individuals who, during the darkest time of humanity, made remarkable things, and can we learn anything from them, and not least we as bureaucrats, diplomats. And Bengt Jangfeldt, Professor Jangfeldt, who says he will speak about Raul Wallenberg and what he did in Budapest. Arlette Liwer, he will speak about Zwartendijk. And Hikari Bun, he will speak about the honorary consul Sugihara. And I will actually add a fourth person, the Swede Valdemar Langley, whom I think has not received enough recognition for what he did in Budapest at the end of the Second World War. And in between will, as said, my old friend Semmy will play Klezmer music, and Semmy is a child of two survivors from the Holocaust that came to Sweden. And by the way, which is a strange coincidence, this summer, when I was on holidays, Semmy called me from, it's a Jewish university in Stockholm called Padea. So you have to speak to this person. His father was saved by Sugihara, and the father compiled what is the Bible of Klezmer music, collected all Klezmer songs around the world, and Klezmer musicians like Semmy use that when they pick Klezmer songs. So perhaps, Semmy, you could say some words about him. Not now, but when you play. So I guess when we study, when we hear and when we read about Wallenbergs and Zwartendijks and Sugiharas and others, I guess we ask ourselves, how would we have reacted? How would we have acted? And I think the short answer to that is we don't know. Because you don't know that until you face the situation like they face. And I would think it's only a tiny minority that act like they did. Most of us would not act that way. But at least we have them as role models, and we know how we could act if we are brave enough. And I tend to believe, but that's my personal belief, that there is a good and there is an evil. And most of us people, we are both good and evil. Hopefully we're a little bit more good than evil. Hopefully when we face a situation like the situations was during the Second World War, we will listen to our better angels. We will act like Antigone in the famous drama of Sophocles, who disregarded all rules and buried her brother, even though it was against the rules of the time. And I've been in the diplomatic career. Next year I've been 40 years in a diplomatic career. I've been everywhere in the world. And I will end my diplomatic career here in Lithuania. And I don't want to compare myself with Wallenberg or Zwartendijk or anyone else, but I have sometimes I have sort of issued visas to people whom I've seen in the countries I've been, and I've been in countries that have been very authoritarian. They've been clearly persecuted, they've been followed, they are wrongly sentenced to things. And I've done it with a good conscience. But I know afterwards I've been heavily criticized. You have broken the rules, how could you do this? You know, do you have to follow the rules? And then imagine, I did that without any risk to my life. But then imagine these 3 people, and I will speak about the 4th, they did that not only breaking the rules, but to a great risk to their own lives. So I guess it boils down, actually, it's one word I like very much. It's a Yiddish word which says everything. It's mensch. They were mensch. And they put human values before rules. And it's also clear, because it's very easy in hindsight to see, oh, they did the correct thing. But they didn't have that sort of luxury. So they must have had a very, very strong moral conviction to do what they did. Against all odds, against the sort of majority of the people. I mean, opposite Sugihara house in Kaunas, there was a Swedish embassy. But I don't know that the Swedish embassy issued a lot of visas. But Sugihara did. And again, we don't know how we will act, but we have those role models, and I think we should keep them in mind. So let me turn to Valdemar Langlais. He came, or his family came from Belgium, France. It was a Huguenot family, as a Lutheran, a Protestant family from France, and they were a little bit persecuted in France. As you know, they came in the 17th century to Sweden. Many of the Langlais were architects, and he grew up in a little mini castle, and actually it's only 7 kilometers from my village in Sweden. He went to Uppsala and studied humanities, and there is a link to Vilnius, which is very interesting, because he founded the 2nd Esperanto community in the world. And Esperanto was invented, you know, by Zamenhof in Vilnius. And he actually started the first Esperanto magazine in the world, Lingvo International. He traveled extensively. He wrote a lot of books. One book is on horseback through Russia. He rode on horse, and I asked Bengt actually yesterday. He rode on horse from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and he visited Tolstoy, which is somewhere outside Moscow, Yashna, what's the name of it? Polyana, yeah. He rode from there down to Ukraine, today's Ukraine, and he met his second wife in Mykolaiv, near to Odessa. He was very conservative. He wrote editorials for the conservative daily in Sweden. During the First World War, he was very pro-German, like many Swedes were. So, why am I saying this? Well, there is nothing in his CV that will tell us that he would act the way he did during the Second World War. In 1930, he became the Swedish lecturer in Budapest, and then he became cultural attaché at the embassy. 1944, the same year as Raul Wallenberg and Professor Bengt Jangfeldt will speak about that, he was appointed the Swedish Red Cross delegate in Budapest. And he actually started this fake passport, Schutzpass, that sort of issued papers that said that this person, even though they had not the slightest connection to Sweden, is under the protection of the Swedish government, and let him pass and blah, blah, blah. And he also, with his own money, bought houses in Budapest that were sort of protected houses. No one knows how many Jews he saved, but some people said tens of thousands. Then the Russian army, or the Soviet army came, the Red Army came. They stayed, they lost all their property. They came back to Sweden, completely unknown, no recognition. They moved in, they could not move into that little mini castle. They moved into a little cottage in the forest. He died 10 years afterwards without having received any recognition. His wife, I remember, she was music teacher at my gymnasium, but no one knew about her. It was completely unknown. And I think, and now there are 2 or 3 parks named after him. And although Yad Vashem bestowed upon him and his wife the title of righteous among the nations, I think he has never received the recognition that he deserves. And I hope with these words that I have given a little contribution to his restoration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Your Excellency, for your contribution. And Semmy Stahlhammer, sorry for the name's pronunciation, I was practicing all night, but still I have some difficulties in pronouncing the names and surnames. So if one or another word seems familiar to your personality, so please go ahead and start your presentation, or at this point, music. So Semmy Stahlhammer will perform as Klezmer music, and now it's time for his performance. So the floor is yours.
So I will play a little traditional Klezmer piece. I'm not sure who has written it, because there are some songs that are just traditional, and this is one of them. And Lars asked me to say a couple of words about this person whose parents were saved by Sugihara, and his name is Zalman Mlotek, and I just happened to meet him a few months ago, and we played together, and we will play together soon again. And his parents were the ones who were saved and who put together all the songs. And you can go into the internet and Google Mlotek Music Collection or Mlotek Song Collection. And he has specially put them up on the internet, so you can just download them without paying.
musical input, and now my pleasure is to give floor to Professor Bengt Jangfeldt, a Swedish scholar who is researching a lot of cases. At this point, he has written a few biographies. One of the latest is biography of the Nobel family. The Nobel family, Swedish geniuses in Tsarist Russia. But also, a few years ago, Professor Jangfeldt has published a book, The Hero of Budapest, The Triumph and Tragedy of Raul Wallenberg. So his contribution would be a presentation on Raul's Wallenberg. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to request. How do I do this? Shut it down. And I can change it.
Full screen. Just the.
Okay, just a moment. There we go. And then I change with the arrows, right?
Fantastic.
Yes.
You can use this one.
Okay. Excuse me. I don't want it in my face. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's kind of humbling for somebody who has been researching Raul Wallenberg to come to a place like Kaunas, where people were doing the same thing but aren't half as known as Raul Wallenberg is, for obvious reasons that we can talk about later. In Sweden, Raul Wallenberg has been a household name ever since World War II. Not only because what he did in Budapest, but also because of his fate. In the final months of the war, he was arrested by the Soviet Red Army, taken to Moscow, where he later perished. After Raul Wallenberg became an honorary citizen of the United States of America in 1981, the second ever in the history of the country, after Winston Churchill, his name became known all over the world. Wallenberg's exceptional achievement and his horrible end are the stuff that heroes are made of. In our days, however, the word hero has become so used so often that it has virtually lost all meaning. If a football player who scores a decisive goal is a hero, then what's left of the word's substance? The myths around Wallenberg's name are many. After having spent years researching his life, I'm glad to be able to state that all he is famed for having done, he actually did. The aura around his name is justified. If the epithet hero is disputable when it comes to football players, in Wallenberg's case, it is not. What did he do then to deserve these epithets, which we should be so careful not to misuse? Before answering that question, let's take a look at Hungary in 1944, when Raul Wallenberg was dispatched there as a Swedish diplomat. Hungary had been a political ally of Nazi Germany since the autumn of 1940, and in 1941 the country tied itself to Germany militarily as well, participating in the attack on the Soviet Union. But there was one question, or one issue, on which the Germans weren't satisfied with the alliance, so that was the Jewish question. Several anti-Jewish laws have been adapted in Hungary, restricting Jewish people both professionally and privately. But the Hungarians refused to accept the German program for the solution of the so-called Jewish problem, that is, to deport the Jews to concentration camps in Poland, where they were put to death. Therefore, the Germans occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944. 2 days later, Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects behind the final solution, the extermination of all Jews, arrived in Budapest. that time, there were almost 1 million Jews living in Hungary, the last Jewish population in Europe that was still intact. Before summer, Adolf Eichmann and his collaborators had taken care of that problem, sending almost 500,000 Hungarian Jews to death camps. According to Winston Churchill, the extermination of the Hungarian Jews were, quote, probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the history of the world, unquote. As opposed to the annihilation of the other European Jews, what happened to the Hungarians in Hungary took place with the world watching. In the spring of 1944, information about what was going on in the concentration camps were spread throughout Europe and the world through the testimonies of 2 Jews who had managed to escape from Auschwitz. But even before that, President Roosevelt had been alerted to the fate of the European Jewry. In January 1944, he therefore created the War Refugee Board, an independent agency answerable directly to the President and entrusted with the task of, quote, rescuing the victims of enemy oppression and establishing havens of temporary refuge for such victims, unquote. When the deportations from Hungary started in May, the American government asked the neutral countries to reinforce their diplomatic presence in Hungary in order to help implement this program. Sweden was the only country to comply, mainly because the war was nearing its end and the Swedish government was eager to neutralize its image of being a little too neutral, exporting products that could be used in the war effort not only by the Allies, but by the Germans as well. As a result, the Swedish Foreign Office, in close cooperation with the US government, decided to send a diplomat to Budapest with the sole task of rescuing Hungarian Jews. The man chosen for the job was Raul Wallenberg, who worked in a trading company importing foodstuffs from Hungary and had traveled a lot to Budapest. The choice was made by the Americans, who recommended Wallenberg to the Swedish Foreign Office. Well, if this sounds strange, it is. A Swede sent as a Swedish diplomat to Hungary on a mission initiated and specified by a foreign state, America. Wallenberg's salary was paid by the Swedish government, but his instructions came from the War Refugee Board, and the economic means that financed his mission were provided by American Jewish organizations. The case may very well be unique in diplomatic history. Why then Wallenberg? You will see his diplomatic passport. There were several reasons why he was chosen. First of all, he had good contacts in Budapest after his many trips there. Secondly, he had plans to go to Hungary anyway in order to save the relatives of his business partner, the Hungarian Jew Abraham Liwer. There was, however, another reason why Raul Wallenberg was the ideal American choice for this mission: his American background. Wallenberg was born into the most influential banking and business dynasty in Sweden, but his life was shadowed from the very beginning by a great sorrow. His father died 3 months before he was born, and he was brought up by his mother, and to an even greater degree by his grandfather Gustav Wallenberg, who came to project on his grandson Raul all the dreams and ambitions he had for his own son, whose name was also Raul. The program that he drew up for Raul was not strictly educational, but had a moral, ethical side to it. Raul was to become a businessman, but also a man with a sense of duty. To be a Wallenberg obliges. If you bear this name, you must act as an example. When Raul turned 23, his grandfather wrote him a letter expressing his hopes for him. I quote, "May all that come true that I have in my mind constantly, that you shall become an able man and bring honor to our family," unquote. His grandfather's program was also of an international character. After finishing high school in Stockholm, Raul was sent to the United States. Not because the schools were better there, but because of the American spirit, as his grandfather wrote. He meant that Raul could learn a lot from that. According to Wallenberg, Americans are less conservative, less conventional, more open-minded, forward-looking than Europeans are. This is a picture of him, and he was a reserve officer. There was this guy, I don't remember exactly what is a reserve officer, ROTC uniform. So he had an army degree actually after finishing Ann Arbor, the Michigan University in Ann Arbor. Well, the university was chosen. That's also interesting. He could have chosen, because the Wallenbergs were a very rich family, they could have chosen Yale, Harvard, Princeton, or one of these Ivy League universities. But he chose Ann Arbor in Michigan, which was not as prestigious, of course, as being State University as the other ones, but there was more of the American spirit, as according to Gustav Wallenberg. The universities on the coast were too Europeanized. And after 3.5 years in Ann Arbor, Raul got a diploma as an architect. He was a skilled draftsman and had wanted to become an architect his whole life. But the ultimate goal of the educational program was to turn Raul into a businessman, into somebody qualified for a leading position within the family business empire. After Michigan, he spent a year in South Africa and in Palestine, now Israel, getting banking and business training before returning to Sweden in 1936. The microphone is, I have the microphone between me and the papers. There's no doubt that Wallenberg's American background played a decisive role when he was chosen for the Budapest mission. When he arrived in Budapest in July 1944, the conditions that had led to his appointment had changed radically. After protests from President Roosevelt, the Pope, and even the Swedish king, the Hungarian government had decided to stop the deportations of Jews. But by then, the Hungarian countryside had already been cleansed of Jews. So Wallenberg's task was to save as many as possible of the 250,000 who live in the capital, Budapest. It is impossible to give an exhaustive account of Wallenberg's remarkable achievements in a short presentation like this. I will therefore limit myself to 2 of his most important actions. One of them is well known, the other less. Although the Germans pressed the Hungarians to resume deportations, a limited number of Hungarian Jews with Swedish business or family ties were promised that they could come to Sweden. Mr. Ambassador told us a little about Langley and the Red Cross, and there were also people at the Swedish embassy or the legation in Budapest who were doing this. In order to protect these people, while they were still in Budapest, Wallenberg, but not only him, came up with the brilliant idea of making them Swedish citizens. In order to do so, he created a special document, the so-called Schutzpass, or the protective passport. And this document was not a regular passport, but valid for one trip only to Sweden, their imaginary homeland. And the passports were produced in such a haste that, if you see the Swedish 3 crowns, right? They're not correct. There should be 2 crowns above and 1 crown below, but this is the other way around. They were printed in the Jewish printer shop very rapidly, and they found out only later that it was wrong, but nobody noticed this among the Hungarians or the Nazis. The trips never realized, no one ever went to Sweden, but there were other advantages connected with the Schutzpasses. The holders were exempt from most anti-Jewish laws. They didn't have to wear the yellow star or live in houses specially designated for Jews, and they were not subject to the curfew rules. this was, of course, against all international laws, to make a citizen of one country the citizen of another. But the Hungarian authorities accepted the idea since they wished to retain a good relationship with neutral Sweden. Raul Wallenberg's name is mostly associated with these protected passports and a number of spectacular rescue actions. But an equally important achievement was his program for housing, medical care, and the provisioning of food for the Budapest Jews. I mean, what's the use of a protected passport if you have no shelter and nothing to eat, if you starve? Wallenberg arranged for his Jews to live in so-called safe houses under Swedish protection, and he hired storerooms and bought enormous amounts of foodstuffs, tons of fats, bacon, canned meat, tomato paste, salted beans, crackers, flour, milk powder, jam, sugar, salt, cigarettes, liquor, which is sometimes used to bribe the Nazis. For those who fell ill, there were 2 hospitals set up by the Swedish legation and the Red Cross. Wallenberg turned out to be something of an organizational genius. Thanks to Wallenberg and rescuers from other nations, notably Switzerland, most of the Budapest Jews survived the war. But for Wallenberg himself, the end of the war meant the beginning of a new ordeal. As the Red Army entered the city, he decided to make contact with them. He wanted to inform the Russians about his rescue missions and asked them not to bomb the houses where the Swedish Jews were living. Indeed, instead he was arrested and brought to Moscow. We don't know for sure when he died or how, but there is a death certificate from July 1947, even if there have been testimonies and rumors claiming that he may have been alive after that date. The most probable hypothesis is, to my mind, that he was murdered in 1947. Now, what conclusions can be drawn from Wallenberg's example? That one man can make a difference? Certainly. During the trial against Eichmann in 1961, one of the witnesses for the prosecution, Arlette Stuip, a Budapest Jew, stated that Wallenberg, quote, was the man who took the initiative, gave us the strength, who gave a personal example. He was the very opposite of everything that was going on in Budapest, unquote. But what was it that turned Wallenberg into someone who made a difference? He was certainly a decent man with a good upbringing and education. He was intelligent. He had a keen sense of duty. But there is no evidence whatsoever of him displaying any particular interest in the Jewish question or in humanitarian matters in general prior to his Hungarian mission. To deduct Wallenberg's extraordinary achievement from his background or upbringing is simplistic. It is well known that many decent, well-educated persons turned a blind eye to what was going on during the war, and what's more, even took part in the crimes. What Raul Wallenberg accomplished in Budapest so far exceeds what one can expect even from the most idealistic, self-sacrificing person, that the explanation must be sought elsewhere. In a letter to his sister, written the same year as he went to Budapest, Raul Wallenberg relates a dinner conversation in Stockholm about crime. During this conversation, he suggested, I quote, that everybody has a price, and it is just a matter of whether the temptation is great enough for anybody to turn into a criminal, unquote. If this is true, and it may very well be so, think of Primo Levi's book, If This Is a Man, where the prisoners in a camp survive by cheating and stealing from one another. Then the opposite is also true. Given the circumstances, anyone can do things he didn't know he was capable of. Good things, even heroic things. Raul Wallenberg did. He rose to the occasion. Thank you.
Professor Jangfeldt, for your contribution to our seminar. And now it's time for our next presenter. And the presentation will be of a little bit different kind because Arlette Liwer from the Netherlands would tell her personal story, her family story, I would say in some way her life, because her grandparents and aunt were saved by Queen Sugihara and Jan Zwartendijk. So this is the very personal presentation. So Arlette, the floor is yours.
Boring person, so I don't understand those stuff.
Hi everyone. I'm the granddaughter of Abraham Liwer. That's my grandfather. I have my cat's pointer. Yeah. This is my father. He escaped from Belgium when he was studying, so he joined the Charles de Gaulle's Free French Forces, and his story is completely separate than the one I will share with you today. I'm going to share with you the story of my grandfather and how he survived thanks to the remarkable visas of Sugihara and Jan Zwartendijk. So survivors were ordinary people with extraordinary stories, and they had foresight, they had stamina, they had courage, but you could say the same about millions who were murdered. You could say that the 1.5 million children who were murdered were resilient. So what the survivors had that was different was the amount of luck. And my grandfather had a remarkable percentage of luck. When he left his town in Poland, where there were 25,000 Jews, 15% survived. And when he left Kaunas here, 1% got out. When he left, 96% of the Jews were murdered, 212,000 when the Germans arrived half a year later. And when he got his wife and daughter out of Siberia, you can say that they were the 0% that escaped. It was harder than escaping Auschwitz. And they were the only two who got out of Siberia while the Germans had a pact with the Soviets. So 7 years ago, I began writing the story of my grandfather's escape after reading an article in the Guardian newspaper about the trauma of second-generation survivors. And I decided to write down everything I knew about him. And it fit exactly 1.5 pages. And I thought I was done. And there was no one left to ask. And my grandfather left no memoir and no passport with visas. So this is Belgium, where my family is from. It was just a few kilometers from the German border and 50 kilometers from Auschwitz. And on September 1st, when the Germans invaded, my grandfather left. Perhaps he left the next day, I'm not exactly sure. But he had read Mein Kampf. He knew what Hitler was capable of. He was a Zionist leader, and he felt that as a very outspoken Jew, he might be one of the first arrested. And he trusted his intuition, and he left immediately. He took the train to Warsaw, and then he got to Lvov, which is now Lviv in Ukraine, traveling as many refugees did, hitching rides on carriages drawn by horses, sleeping in the forest at night. And when he got here, everything was wonderful. The Soviets were handing out candy to the children, he got a furnished room, they went to the theater, there were concerts, my aunt was learning to speak Russian. They could forget there was a war going on, they actually said that. And that ended for my grandfather suddenly on the day that he bumped into an employee on the street. When my grandfather lived in Benjin, he was part owner of a bicycle parts factory, and 300 people worked there. And one of them bumped into him on the street. And my grandfather knew that if that employee reported him as a factory owner, a capitalist, a bourgeois, that was a crime worse than murder for the communists. He could be sent to Siberia. So he left within minutes, not so unlike when he had left his town the first time in Benjin. Only this time he traveled alone. Many men at that point in time felt it was safe to leave their wives and children behind. And it was safe there. So he headed up north towards Lithuania. And he decided to cross the border on New Year's Eve, hoping that the guards would be drunk. And they were. Lots of vodka. He had a guide, and he crossed on December 31st, 1939. But it was the coldest winter at that point in the 20th century. It was 50 degrees below 0 centigrade. Parts of the Baltic Sea froze, and he lost part of his toe to frostbite. And he made it to Vilnius, and he was familiar with Vilnius because he had studied there in his youth. He was secular Zionist, he was not religious, but his parents were, and they had sent him to study at a yeshiva, a Jewish school in Vilnius. Now, 6 months after he was there, back in Lvov, the Soviets gave all the refugees a choice. Check this box that you will remain here, become a Soviet citizen, which meant never leave. Check this box if you want to return where you came from, which is now the German-occupied part of what was Poland. And my grandmother had gotten letters that there was no problem, things weren't that bad, so she checked the so-called wrong box to go back to her town, which later turned out to be the right box because it's what saved her life. And everyone who checked the wrong box was rounded up by the Soviets. So on the night of June 29th and June 30th, Stalin liked when people worked at night. There was a bang on the door, and my aunt and grandmother were rounded up and put on a train and sent to Siberia. It was a 2-week train ride with no food or drink. And actually within 4 days, the Soviets rounded up 77,000 refugees, 83% of them Jewish. Okay, so now I'm going to take you back to Kaunas, because my story can't go in chronological order because too many things are happening at exactly the same time. It's like a time travel. So in Kaunas, Philips, that's a Dutch company which was famous for radios, light bulbs, shavers, sent Jan Zwartendijk here in 1938 to be director of the Philips office. He became friends with, let me go to the next slide. Okay. Yes. Okay, so that's Jan Zwartendijk. He comes to work for Philips. He becomes friends with Nathan Goodworth, who was a Dutch yeshiva student. There weren't that many Dutch people here. And they socialized a little bit. He would give him his Dutch newspapers. When he had finished reading them, they talked about soccer. They had that common interest. May 10, 1940, the Germans invade Holland and Belgium, and the Dutch ambassador to the Baltics asks him if he will become the Dutch consul. Okay, he wants to get rid of the present consul, who's German actually, and asks him if he will be the Dutch honorary consul, voluntary consul. And he has 0 diplomatic training, 0 experience, is busy as director, but wants to help, and he agrees, thinking there wouldn't be that much work because there's not that many Dutch people here. Maybe one of them might need a passport renewed one day. And the very next day, the Soviets invade, and now the refugees are trapped again. So, My laser's no longer working, okay? Nathan Goodward asks him if he can get a visa to Curaçao in the Dutch West Indies, and he explains that's not possible, there is no such thing. And Pesla Lewin, who's Dutch, but she lost her Dutch nationality when she married a Polish man, wants to go to the East Indies, and that's not possible. They contact his superior, Ambassador De Decker. He's in Riga, and he explains, it's not possible for me to issue you a visa to the East Indies, and there is no visa for Suriname or Curaçao in the West Indies. And they both sort of in parallel come up with a very creative wording which saves the day. People disagree, she was first, he was first. Actually, her brother was his best friend, so they could have communicated that way. But they both individually came up with a very creative wording, which was to ask Ambassador De Decker, can you write in my passport, no visas required, instead of no visas given? Can you change that wording? And he'd explain, you just go there, and it's up to the local governor. There is no visa, but if you go there, the local governor decides if you can disembark or not. Let me tell you right now, he says no to everybody, especially if you're not Dutch. So they said, can you just leave out that part about the governor, and leave out the part that there's no visa given, and write down no visas required? And he said, yes, I can do that. Mail me your passport. And Pesla mails him the passport, and he writes it in a very diplomatic language, French. It looks very official. No visas required for Curaçao. And she goes to him, and he gives him instructions to copy it for her husband, even though he's Polish, and her mother who's with her, she's Dutch, and her brother who's with her, he's Dutch. And she has an infant who can go on her passport. And he asks him to copy it exactly for those 4 others, and also Nathan Goodward, who is Dutch. So he copies it for her mother, her brother, and her husband. And he copies it for Nathan Goodward. So that was to follow his instructions. Pesla is in a hurry to leave. She has no reason to stay. But Nathan is in no hurry to leave because he wants to get married to his fiancée, but first she needs a Dutch passport. He takes the passport and shows it to Warhafte. And Warhafte is a very influential man. He has a lot of contacts. He's a lawyer. He knows a lot of rabbis. He later becomes the minister of religion in Israel. He's a really big guy. And he says to Nathan Goodward, can you go back to Jan Zwartendijk and ask if he will issue the same visa to the refugees here? You know, Polish Jews, they're not Dutch. Nathan goes back to Jan Zwartendijk, asks him the question, and he, without checking with his superior in Riga, without asking his permission, without informing him, on his own responsibility, and also his own great risk, because he's with a wife and 3 children, says anyone who comes to me will get the same visa. And Nathan tells Warhafte, and Warhafte spreads the word, and the word spreads like wildfire. So he's telling everyone in the shtetls, the Jewish towns, in the cities, Vilnius, Kaunas, in the yeshivas, the Jewish schools, to all the rabbis, go as soon as you can, as fast as you can, line up outside his office and get yourself a visa to Curaçao now. And a few dozen show up, and then it's a few hundred, and then it's a few thousand. And in 9 days, if you don't count the first few, in 9 days, he issues 2,345 visas. I remember it because it's 2, 3, 4, 5. So De Decker was responsible for agreeing to 5. And thanks to Pesla, her family of 5 survived. And thanks to Nathan Goodward, 2,345 survived. And he knew that he was running a double risk, because he knew that on August 3rd the Soviets were going to close him down. He knew that he had 0 diplomatic immunity, no protection whatsoever. He knew that the ambassador would be gone, so he couldn't help him. He had never checked with the Dutch government in exile in London. They didn't even know what he was doing. They were powerless, so he knew he was on his own. And he knew that the Soviets, he was a capitalist. He ran a business, so he could easily be arrested with no protection. And he knew that he was returning to Holland as soon as he could close his office and get out. And that was Nazi occupied. And they would not take kindly on someone who had saved nearly 2,500 Jews. And again there, he would have no diplomatic immunity. He wasn't a real diplomat. And again there, nobody could help him. And he risked, therefore, the life of his wife and 3 children. Okay. So Tesla went immediately to Sugihara at the Japanese consulate. This is the visas of my grandmother, who wasn't there, and my aunt and my grandfather. So he got it for them even though they were in Siberia. And Sugihara was more than willing to issue a transit visa for 10 days to Japan. He looked at the passport, it looked very official, it was written in French, it was stamped, as he was equally willing to issue it to all the other people who showed up. They had a destination visa, and everyone knows you first need a destination visa before you can get a transit visa. There were a few exceptions who came with visas to America and visas to Palestine. They did not need the Curaçao visa, but the great majority needed that. And you can therefore say that without Zwartendijk, there would have been no Sugihara, and vice versa. One could not have succeeded without the other. And even though they never met, there was one phone call where Sugihara asked him to slow down because the Dutchman was using the rubber stamp and the Japanese man was using the calligraphy. But there's no record of them ever having met. And the proof of how one could have only succeeded without the other is that 74 refugees went to Sugihara without the Zwartendijk visa. Zwartendijk closed on August 3rd, and Sugihara was allowed to remain open for another 3 weeks. So when people couldn't go to Zwartendijk because it was closed, and they came to him, it was incredible, but he gave them the transit visa anyway. He was supposed to only issue a transit visa if someone had a destination visa, but he broke the rule and issued it anyway. Those 74 people arrived in Japan and were refused entrance. They did not have the Curaçao destination visa. They could not get into Japan. And their boat was sent back to the Soviet Union. And the fear was they'd be arrested as spies and sent to Siberia. And Nathan Goodworth, the yeshiva student, saved the day. He made sure that 74 copies of those so-called Curaçao visas were issued from the Dutch consul there, De Vogt, in Japan. It was telegraphed to the captain on the boat, and before they disembarked in the Soviet Union, the boat came back and those 74 people were saved. So that's just to show how important that destination visa was. Okay. So, whereas most refugees were happy to get a visa, my grandfather seemed to stockpile them. He collected visas. He got a visa to Palestine from the British embassy with Preston. He got a 30-day visa to the United States with help of someone in America. He got the Japanese visa, the Dutch Curaçao visa, the Soviet exit visa. He even went to the NKVD, the KGB, and asked for a permit to bring his wife and daughter to him. That cost 10,000 litas in 1940, that's $2,000 in 1940. My grandfather had left all his money and jewelry with his wife when he left them in Lvov. But he was sort of a wizard at making money. He would see someone on the street and say, I'll buy those shoes, and he'd turn around and sell them to someone else for 10 times the price. And when his wife and daughter were in Siberia, he was allowed to send them packages. The Germans didn't allow anything to the German camps, but the Soviets allowed packages, 1 a month. And to make sure you didn't do more than that, they stamped it in your passport in the post office. And my grandfather would pay people to take the package and get it stamped in their passport. And in this manner, my grandmother and aunt got incredible luxuries in Siberia, like woolen socks and gloves and sardines and chocolate. So, okay. But he did have that permit to bring his wife and daughter that he had spent $2,000, and they were not brought to him, but he had the paper. And that was very, very important for later on. So he took the train to Moscow, and then he took the, the Siberian Express. He passed this town, which I highlighted in yellow because that's where his wife and daughter were, a few hundred kilometers up north in Siberia, until he got to Vladivostok, the harbor here, at the end of the Soviet Union. I think it took him about 16 days. And the other refugees would get off the train and they would run straight, make a beeline to the boats going to Japan. They did not want to be hanging around this place. There were pogroms, there was the NKVD, it was a dangerous place. And if they arrived and the boat to Japan was not ready, because it took a few days, it was going back and forth, they would hide in their hotel, but they would not be caught dead walking around. And even the Soviets were afraid, because if they went to the NKVD building, for example, and said, my husband disappeared a few months ago, can you help me? They would send the wife to Siberia. So people made big, big detours. And my grandfather did the opposite. He went right into the NKVD building and he said, I'm not leaving without my wife and daughter. So everything I've told you till now, I've learned through my research. But what I'm going to share with you now is a story I've heard since I was born. This is the story that my family repeated over and over. He walked in and there was an officer who helped him. And it was a female. So this woman, lieutenant, in a dark brown leather jacket, carrying a Luger gun, had a crush on my grandfather. He was tall, he was blonde, he had blue eyes, he did not look Jewish at all, and she just was flirting with him. And Comrade, why do you want to go to capitalist America? This is the paradise, you should join your wife and daughter and stay here. No, no, blah, blah. For 3 months. He kept coming back every day for 3 months and they were flirting. And he kept waiving this permit that he got here in Kaunas that his wife and daughter could join him, that he had spent the $2,000. And he kept saying, your government made a mistake. Your government gave them permit to be with me, and your government locked them up, and you made a mistake. And that was just unheard of. And finally, the last day, she said, what can you possibly do in America you can't do here? This is the best place on earth. And he thought quickly, because she had so many questions, and he said, I'm a rabbi. I can't teach my religion here. And she said, okay, okay, okay. And she telegrammed her superiors in Moscow, and the next thing you know, my aunt and grandmother were in Siberia 9 months. The guards came to get them, put them on the train there, and accompanied them to Vladivostok, where they reunited with my grandfather after 9 months in Siberia. So yes, they got out, and we call his argument in Yiddish chutzpah, that he used their own permit against them and it actually won. Another jump, okay? This is like in the meanwhile, somewhere far away, something else is happening. The Soviets closed his Phillips office and his Dutch consulate on August 3rd. And he feared being arrested by them because they were not giving him an exit visa. He sent his teenage children far away to a farm just for emergencies, and he sat in an empty apartment with his wife and newborn baby waiting to see what would happen. And after 4 weeks, they gave him this exit visa, and he returned to Holland, which was Nazi-occupied. And he went to a town called Eindhoven, where his Philips business was located, the main office. And he lived for 4 years next door to German officers. We know now it was for 4 years, but he didn't know if the Germans would win or how many years it would go on. And he was terrified, day and night, that there would be a knock on the door and he would be arrested. Because what he did in Kaunas was in broad daylight. It was not secret. There were thousands of people in front of his door, and the town was teeming with agents and lots of German spies. So the fact that his file never reached the Germans in Holland is a miracle. He just fell in the crack. and it was never discovered. So nothing happened until the 1960s. He never spoke about what he did. His son was 36 years old when he found out about it, the one that was born there. And he was a very modest man, and he just went on with his life. And in the 60s, somebody approached a journalist in Los Angeles and said, I'd like to find the Angel of Curaçao. They didn't know his name. He was Mr. Phillips, Mr. Radio. Nobody could remember Zwartendijk. And the journalist in California started doing an investigation how to find him. Asked the Dutch consul in Los Angeles, who asked the Dutch embassy in DC, who asked the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague, in Holland, who said, we never heard of this man, we have nothing in our files. Who? They contacted the Phillips office, and the Phillips office sent them his name and contact. They knew nothing. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs contacts him and says, please write a report about what you did. Jan Zwartendijk fudges it. He knows he's on shaky ground, he's never talked about it. He says, I can't remember what I wrote, I can't remember how many exactly there were. And okay, a few months later he gets invited into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague. And he's very excited. And I know this because I was friends with his daughter and his son, and they know the story, they were right there. He got all dressed up. It was a very, very special day for him. He was going to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague. I have a special coffee. And he got there and it was the opposite. They gave him a big slap on the wrist, and they were quite angry with him, and how dare you, and you didn't follow proper protocol, and you weren't even a real diplomat, and who told you you could do this, and da-da-da. And he came home, and his daughter was there also when he returned, and she told me that he was a different man. He changed that day. He was dejected, he had a cup of tea, he went to sleep depressed. It was horrible. And from then until the day he died, he had one burning question, and that was to find out if anybody had survived. Because he was really afraid that because of him, they had met their death. He had no idea. He didn't hear from them afterwards. And his greatest fear was that they'd gotten on the train, the Soviets had yanked them off and sent them to Siberia. Some had died. He had no idea. He really tried to find out.
So Arlette, you have 4 minutes more.
4 minutes more, I can do that. I can do that. 7 years ago I started my research. I'm not a historian, I'm not a writer. I was very puzzled by all the discrepancies. Everybody was saying there's 2,000 saved, there's 4,000. There's a big book that said 6,000, many articles said 8,000, a movie 10,000, incredible. So I had no idea that historians, but anyway, what bothered me emotionally was that he was never recognized, not even in Holland, no one ever heard of him. And Sugihara, many, many books, many, many articles, movies, documentaries, and it didn't make sense to me because they both played an equal role. So I made it my mission in life, my goal in life, to set the record straight. And now I'm going to go really fast because I have 3 minutes left. Yad Vashem, a very prestigious Holocaust museum in Israel, recognized him with a Righteous Award in 1997. That was 57 years after he issued the visas, 21 years after he died, and 13 years after she and Sugihara got it. And then, nothing. And then a big 21 years later, Jan Broka wrote this book, The Just. It's in 12 languages. It's being translated now into Japanese. And all of a sudden, a big bestseller, people knew about him. And then the last few years, it really started snowballing. The Phillips Museum had an exhibition. There's a memorial of lights just 5 minutes from here, in front of where his old Phillips office was. And a big statue here on the right, that's an Eindhoven, in the 6 meters high. It changes colors when you walk under it. And then an open letter to the king resulted in this. It's the highest award you can get in Holland. Only 100 have gotten it. That's the Prime Minister of Holland, Rutte, handing it out. That's his children. And then the same artist made this for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm going to go really, really fast now. And this is my dream come true, that both men are celebrated together, as it should be. Okay? This is the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw that made a big, big exhibition about both men. capital of New York, 25,000 kilometers. And I recently discovered something that blew me away, that in Albany, New York, there's a park called the Wallenberg Park, and there's 3 plaques in there, 3 plaques, Sugihara, Zwartendijk, and Raul Wallenberg. And I've been trying to find out the story. I called the what do you call him? The mayor's office, journalists. Boy, did I work hard. Nobody knows why there's 3 plaques in this one park. Nobody knows. And I love that they call Jan Zwartendijk the Dutch Wallenberg. I'm done. Bye. Thank you.
Dear Arlette, thank you for very entertaining and enlightening presentation. At this point we are coming back to music, and I would like to invite once more Semmy Stahlhammer for another performance.
Okay, so this time I will play a little lullaby, and this lullaby is actually written in Vilnius. In the ghetto. Yeah, in Vilnius, in the ghetto. Yeah. And about probably 1940, whatever, in the beginning of the 1940s. And what happened was that there was a woman who was walking in the ghetto. She finds a little child, abandoned child, on the street, on the sidewalk. And she picks up the child and sings a lullaby. She makes up a lullaby. And then it's about, the words is approximately, on a branch in a tree sits a little bird, sleep, my dear child. And on this branch you have a friend singing for you.
Thank you, Semmy. And now the floor goes to our next colleague, PhD student at Heidelberg University, but coming from Japan, young Japanese researcher, Hikari Bun. She is researching on Holocaust perception and lessons to the Japanese society, but also she spent some time at our museum also interviewing the Japanese visitors, visiting Sugihara House Museum, and she will contribute her presentation on Chunya Sugihara story. So the floor is yours.
Sorry. It's not working. Sorry, maybe I'm too short.
No, no.
Okay. So, thank you for introduction, and it's a great pleasure that I can make a presentation here today. And first, I would like to thank the Swedish Embassy and the Swedish Institute and the Sugihara House for holding this event and having me as a presenter, despite the fact that I'm still a student and maybe have got less experience compared to other lovely two presenters today. So I'm now doing a research about the Holocaust perception in Japan, and as part of my research, I'm looking at how the Japanese people look at and remember the Sugihara Chunya, and through Sugihara, how the Japanese people see and understand the Holocaust. And as one of case studies, I conducted some interviews with Japanese visitors at the Sugihara House in Kaunas, and today I would like to share some results of those interviews. But I'd like to note that this is still a kind of tentative results, because I did interviews in this August and September, and I finished transcribing all the interviews just 2 weeks ago, so this is still kind of early stage of research. So today I'm not really talking about who Sugihara is and what he did, but I would like to show some examples of how the Japanese people see Sugihara, and I hope this is still interesting to you. But before doing that, I just want to add that, do you all know who Sugihara is and what he did in the context of this seminar? Okay, excellent. So then I can go to my outline. So here's the outline of my presentation. First, I'll briefly explain my data that we do my interviews, and then I will introduce a few definitions about what kind of hero Sugihara can be. And then I will show some excerpts of the interviews at the Sugihara House, and then I will discuss how Sugihara could be both national and universal hero. So about the data, so I conducted interviews with 61 Japanese visitors to the Sugihara House, and interviews were conducted in Japanese, of course, but in this presentation I translated into English. So, and I asked those visitors before they leave the museum, and if they have good time and interest for interview for research. And if they said yes, I interviewed them in a museum or nearby cafe or park. So for those interviews, they are all individual visitors, which means that I didn't interview the visitors in a group, in a package tours, because they have got quite strict schedule and they don't have time for interviews. So then interview lasts between 15 to 30 minutes, or sometimes longer, but it depends on the number of people and answers. And their ages range from around 19 to 70, so the youngest one is 19. And yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have an equal number of female and male interviews. There were slightly more male interviews. And about their occupation, a number of them are university students, including the exchange students in a European university, and there are also some school teachers and university lecturers, and also the experts or the representative of Japanese companies staying in Europe. And around half of my interviews belong to these groups, but there are also some those who work in other sectors, like the office workers or freelance journalists, someone working in gastronomy or also in the nurses or something like this. So I would say those interviews are not representing or mirroring the entire Japanese society, but I still managed to interview some different kinds of people. And before we're going to see the excerpts from the interview, I'd like to introduce a few quotes from a book about Raul Wallenberg's monument, written by an art historian, Anders Schultz. So we can start from these descriptions and definition of a hero and see how it is also shared in the case of Sugihara. The first one is about Holocaust hero, and I think this is also relevant to Jay's theme as well. So examples like Wallenberg can inspire political action that then establishes a global ethos based on the Holocaust remembrance. Such examples offer the adoption of positive values for future action, and a Holocaust hero is considered to be an example for moral guidance and human rights politics. And the next one is about the universal hero and national hero. The heroes of the 20th century were often national heroes. National heroes are characterized by their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their nation, such as the countless soldiers who died while serving their country, or for people's achievements in science, sports, or culture. Wallenberg represents a different hero type, the non-patriotic or universal hero. Actually, it is this categorization that makes Wallenberg such an appropriate hero figure for so many societies in the Western world. So what I want to show in the rest of the presentation is that those who are interviewed certainly see Sugihara as Holocaust hero and universal hero, maybe a bit like Wallenberg. Sugihara had a cosmopolitan life as a diplomat, even if not so much as Wallenberg. His achievement was once neglected by the Japanese government. This is something to do with the widespread understanding that Sugihara issued visas against the order of Japanese Foreign Ministry, and he was forced to resign after the war because of that, although there is still debate if it was still the case. And survivors who received visas from Sugihara scattered around the world, mostly in the US and Israel. However, Sugihara is also seen and understood as a national hero, and some interviews suggested that he is national hero because he is a universal hero. Does it sound weird? But I hope you know what I mean before the end of this presentation. So I'd like to start with responses to the question, how do you see Sugihara and what does he mean to you? In the responses, the interviewees, in one or another way, acknowledge the Sugihara as a heroic figure for his outstanding act of saving Jews. For example, some interviewees named Sugihara's personal characters that apparently enabled him to take an action to issue visas to save refugees, such as determination, strength of will, or perseverance, generosity, beneficence, humanitarian, courage, bravery, and independence. And many interviewees also praise the act itself or his decision as extraordinary, which is made independently of the Japanese government. And some interviewees emphasize the extraordinary quality of the Sugihara's act by saying, like, probably I cannot do the same thing if we're in that situation, but not everyone can do the same. But at the same time, Sugihara is also seen as a kind of role model or ideal that encouraged people to act like him. So I think that fits to the idea of the Holocaust hero, which I introduced earlier. And some interviewees also named the impact and legacy of Sugihara's act today, like how his legacy connects Japan and Lithuania, or Japan and Israel. The fact that Sugihara is honored outside of Japan shows that he is an internationally outstanding figure and spread abroad positive images of Japan. And this is one point, is how Sugihara can be understood as national hero because he is a universal hero, whose significance and fame transcend the national border. So this interviewee emphasizes the Sugihara's personal character. So Sugihara had extraordinary determination not to give up his own belief. The interviewee also mentions a legacy, like leaving one's own name for a long time until today. And he also said that it is not what everyone can do to follow his own belief and act independently of the government's order. And the next one, so this interviewee describes Sugihara as a courageous person and said that she could not have done the same thing if she would have been in the same situation. And this interviewee says, so I wondered if I could have done the same. Well, I'm in a completely different profession, but I wish to keep a spirit like him to defend humanitarianism and human life. So he's not sure if he can do the same thing in the same situation, but he still sees Sugihara as a kind of moral guidance and a role model in a more general sense, who tells him the importance of humanitarianism and human life. Okay, that's the next one. So this interviewee also sees Sugihara as a kind of moral guidance and ideal. So she said, I respect him because he cherished what is important as a human being after all, despite the fetters of the government and his duty, and this is important for everyone. So Sugihara and his deeds teach how one should act and make judgment in their life, regardless of what government says. Okay, so the next one finds Sugihara's legacy and friendly relationship between Lithuania and Japan. So she said, thanks to Sugihara's work, Lithuania is a friendly country for Japan, for example, showing great interest in Japanese culture, to transatlantic encounters, so in this way he connects the two countries even 80 years after his act of issuing business encounters. Okay, and the next one also names Sugihara's legacy, but a slightly different way. And it is great pleasure that there was a such Japanese figure in the past. We Japanese today owe to the Japanese in the past, especially Sugihara and also other Japanese historical figures. For example, we can go to quite many places with Japanese passport. So I think that the Japanese in the past established some reliability to Japan. Okay, and I think this interview's response suggests how Sugihara can be a national hero because he is a universal hero. It said Sugihara is a pride of Japan, like Tetsu Nakamura, a Japanese doctor who was active in Afghanistan. And the interview respects those people who commit themselves in a faraway country. It means that Japanese individuals who are active in a foreign country, not necessarily on behalf of the Japanese nation, could be identified as a Japanese national hero because of their commitment beyond national border and with non-Japanese people. And because I frequently found phrases like feeling proud of Sugihara as Japanese, or he is a pride of Japan also in the guest book of the museum, so when an interviewer said something similar, I asked further to them, what does it mean to feel proud of Sugihara as Japanese? Is it something to do with nationalism or patriotism? Then the same interview answered as following. I assume that one feels glad when someone from a group to which you belong achieves something great, and the interview named two famous Japanese baseball players, and so drawing some parallels with the national heroes in sports. But then at the end he asked, what is it? Nationalism. So he's maybe a bit cautious to call it nationalism and connect in that way. So let's see another one. So this interview says nationality shouldn't matter, it doesn't matter to decide who is outstanding and who is not. But he also says, but I think that I'm simply glad when a Japanese person is praised by foreigners. So for this interview, Sugihara is not just a national hero, but he is known and praised beyond Japan, and this generates some positive feeling as Japanese, whether it is called nationalism or not. Then another interviewer said, for me, it's not really because Sugihara is Japanese. He appears appears in a Japanese travel guidebook and a film, probably the Dutch consul, Jan Zwartendijk, might be also introduced in Japanese texts, but Sugihara remains in memory more easily and seems somewhat familiar. However, today film proud Japanese in note, or how to say, Sugihara is more like one example for me of what I should do in a difficult situation. So according to this interview, nationality shouldn't matter actually, and she also suggested that national pride is a kind of outdated idea today, but it might be still easier to identify with someone with the same nationality. In contrast, this interview appeared quite positive about describing his feeling as nationalism. He said there was the Olympic Games just recently, because I conducted the interview in August, so it was quite close to the Paris Olympic. And when someone from the same nation achieves great results, though it might be a bit weird to compare with Sugihara's case, it might be similar to sports. It arouses nationalism. Well, of course, Sugihara and I lived in different periods, but he was a Japanese person like me, which arouses nationalism, and in that sense, I'm impressed with the fact that there was such a great Japanese figure. So this interview sees the Sugihara clearly as a national hero, and maybe a bit comparable to the case of heroes in sports. So here's the conclusion. So I showed some responses of the Japanese visitors to the Sugihara house and how they see the Sugihara achievement. And their responses suggested that they acknowledge Sugihara as an outstanding person, and the significance of his deed is acknowledged beyond Japan. And in that sense, like the case of Wallenberg or other Holocaust heroes, Sugihara serves as a moral guidance to inspire people for future action, but at the same time, for some interviewees, if not all of them, it is still matters that he is Japanese. He is seen as pride of Japan or national hero of Japan because of his commitment outside of Japan towards non-Japanese people and the fact that he is honored outside Japan. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, should I say again? Or
If you want to, yes, we'll then have the discussion. So
no,
sure.
but then I wait. If you have to start, whichever you want first.
Yeah, so we have been speaking for already 2 hours, so I understand that everyone is already tired with the presentations. Nonetheless, all of them were important and interesting and inspiring. So I have a lot of questions, but I limit myself at this point. Now, unless the audience has some questions at this point or some remarks, because we have been presented from different countries, different heroes, to use the last term in the Hikari's presentation. So Wallenberg, Sugihara, Zwartendijk. At this point, are there any questions or comments for the presenters?
I actually have questions.
Yes, so that's why we have 2 microphones.
Yeah, I want to ask, so for someone from Sweden, how the Wallenberg is honored in Sweden? Is it similar to what I described as Sugihara, was it kind of different?
Who would be the Swedish and you can give to your colleague the microphone. Yeah.
Well, we have nothing to be proud of in Sweden. And what struck me when I heard about Zwartendijk and Sugihara was, of course, that none of these people were recognized in time. The Swedish Foreign Office was terrible when it came to Wallenberg because he had acted in a way a diplomat shouldn't do. And the Jewish question wasn't topical after the war, it became topical long afterwards, right? It was, I would say that Wallenberg became topical after he became an American citizen in '81, after the television series Holocaust and all that, and we were just terrible. I mean, there were monuments and parks all the world. We got our monument for Wallenberg about 20 years ago, something like that, yeah, with a square called Wallenberg. So it's a big shame in Swedish history, I would say. I'm sorry, you're a diplomat, you don't have to defend yourself now.
No, I would agree, actually, and there were Swedish diplomats working with Wallenberg, like Per Anger, and they and the family of Raul Wallenberg, they really tried for decades to put pressure on the Swedish government to do something more forceful, but also to put some more recognition into his name. And it was, as Bengt says, it was only after, I think it was a US Congressman, Tom Lantos,
Yes.
who had been saying about Raul Wallenberg, and there was this US sort of move or wave and the film and the books that he became a household name in Sweden. And it is a little bit like Zwartendijk or Sugihara. I don't know how he was.
And also while he was working Wallenberg, he knew that he had the support of the US government. I mean, Sugihara and Zwartendijk didn't have any support at all. So there was a big difference.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, can you imagine that some Swedish persons travel to Budapest just because they travel to Budapest, and they definitely visit the Wallenberg monument in there and that kind of thing. Like, because when Japanese travel to Lithuania, I can imagine that most of them come to Kaunas and visit the Sugihara museum, like a Sugihara house. But can you imagine a similar thing for Swedish people, that when they travel as a tourist to go to Budapest, and then would they definitely go to the Wallenberg monument to there and to feel proud of being Swedish? Can you imagine that?
I think so. Now we tried to stay out of the war, and we were neutral, and we were dealing with both sides, which was not very heroic. So I guess now most Swedes are proud of Wallenberg.
Yes.
And
there's never been a question of the Swedish people, because the Wallenberg question was raised very early by journalists in Sweden, for example. It was the Swedish Foreign Office that was very kind of the Swedish government, and they, of course, they knew that Wallenberg had committed irregularities by issuing all these passports. Right? I mean, I think the embassy or the legation at that time were more or less on his side, but they also thought that he had been going too far. I mean, he was really dangerous, politically and diplomatically dangerous, to issue tens of thousands of Schutzpasses, because you never knew, after all, who you were giving them to, right?
Okay, so if there are no more questions, then Sammy, the floor is yours. We are ready for the music.
One more key?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
And it would be a happy one.
A happy one.
Yeah. That's okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so this is a Klezmer piece that we usually play with my little ensemble at weddings, but I will try to do a wedding for one violin.
inspiring final melody. And actually, we have been working already for 2 hours, not only speaking but listening to the music. But it's time to finalize our seminar, and I think it was very important and full of different thoughts, while getting the different perspectives, different insights. On one hand, on the other hand, we do need events like this. On another hand, I cannot react to Arlette's presentation, which was highlighting some important, let's say, actions in memorizing Jan Zwartendijk or the decoration or the monument. But at this point also, quite often we are forgetting regular work on the issue. So at this point, from 2005, at our museum, Sugihara House Museum, Zwartendijk story is told on the regular basis. Queen Beatrix visited us in 2008. So sometimes it seems that something very important is done, and as if the problem is solved. But this is ongoing work. So that's why I'm very grateful to our Swedish colleagues that they proposed this seminar, and the next seminar will be in Vilnius. So if you are traveling like us, so we will meet tomorrow in Vilnius. But actually, it is very important to meet, to sit, to discuss, to highlight new points, and to move those processes going forward, because new discoveries are done, new interpretations are coming, and my final words, thanks goes first of all to Ąžuolynas Library, the hosting institution, which let us to have the seminar here, and of course to the Swedish Embassy and His Excellency Lars Wagmund with his contribution, also to Per. Quite often there are people standing behind the scenes and organizing things, and of course also we are very grateful to the Swedish Institute for sponsoring our event. So those who by chance or definitely would go to Vilnius to the seminar, so the date and place are on the poster. So thank you once more. By this we are finalizing our seminar, unless Semmy would give us another melody for the end of the seminar.
You can play a Swedish folk song.
Okay, so sometimes it's difficult to know what Jewish music is. But now I'm going to play a piece which is actually also Jewish music by a Jewish composer, and you will see if you recognize it.
Thank you.